There are places in this world that were never meant to be fully understood. Places where the ground beneath your feet is not quite solid, where the water does not simply flow but lingers, where the trees grow roots above the surface as if they too are unsure whether to commit to land or water. Louisiana is one of those places. A state that exists in a permanent negotiation between the dry and the wet, the living and the dead, the visible and the thing at the edge of your vision that you are not entirely sure you saw. Today we go there. Not to the French Quarter at Mardi Gras, not to the jazz clubs of New Orleans on a Friday night. We go to the other Louisiana, the one underneath. Let us begin with the ground itself, because in Louisiana, the ground is a lie. Most of Louisiana was not here 1,000 years ago. The entire southern half of the state is built on sediment deposited by the Mississippi River over thousands of years, layer by layer. A geological process so slow and so continuous that the land Louisiana stands on today is, in geological terms, brand new, and it is disappearing. Every hour, Louisiana loses approximately a football field of land to the Gulf of Mexico. Not metaphorically, literally. The coastline is dissolving. Marshes that appeared on maps 50 years ago are now open water. Islands that were inhabited within living memory are submerged. The United States Geological Survey estimates that Louisiana has lost over 2,000 square miles of land since the 1930s. Scientists who study coastal erosion in Louisiana use a phrase that appears in almost no other context in American geography. Louisiana is not losing land. Louisiana is becoming water. And underneath the streets of New Orleans, which sits in a bowl below sea level, in some places by as much as 6 feet, the earth is compacting and sinking at a rate that no engineering solution has fully been able to stop. The city is, in the most precise technical sense, slowly going under. But before we go further into what Louisiana is losing, let us talk about what it was before anyone arrived to name it. The land that is now Louisiana was inhabited for at least 12,000 years before European contact. Among the most remarkable and least discussed archaeological discoveries in North America is a site in northern Louisiana called Poverty Point, a complex of earthen mounds built by a culture that existed between roughly 1,700 and 1,100 BCE. These were not simple burial mounds. The main ridge at Poverty Point consists of 6 concentric semicircular earthworks arranged around a central plaza, with the outermost ridge stretching over 3/4 of a mile in diameter. The people who built this moved an estimated 50 million cubic feet of earth without the use of wheels, metal tools, or draft animals. Researchers estimate it would have taken 300 people working every day for 30 years to move that much earth by hand. And here's the part that does not appear in most history books. The people who built Poverty Point were not farmers. They were hunter-gatherers. Nomadic people or semi-nomadic who somehow organized themselves at a scale of construction that most settled agricultural civilizations of the same era could not match. Nobody knows precisely why they built it. Nobody knows precisely what happened to them. The site was rediscovered by aerial photography in the 1950s, and the full scale of what it was did not become clear until researchers looked at it from above. From the ground, you cannot see the pattern. Only from the sky does the shape reveal itself. Now, we go into the swamp. The Atchafalaya Basin is the largest river swamp in the United States, a vast flooded forest of bald cypress and Spanish moss stretching across over 1 million acres of south-central Louisiana. It is one of the most ecologically rich environments in North America, home to species found nowhere else on Earth. But it is also one of the most disorienting landscapes a human being can enter. The Atchafalaya does not behave like other wildernesses. The landmarks shift. Water levels change seasonally and sometimes daily. Channels that existed last week may be blocked by fallen trees or rerouted by flood this week. Experienced guides who have worked the basin for decades describe a phenomenon they call getting turned around a state that goes beyond simple navigational confusion into something closer to spatial dissolution. The trees close in. The reflections on the water make it impossible to tell which direction the sky is. The moss hanging from every branch creates a visual texture so uniform that depth perception stops working the way it should. People have gotten lost in the Atchafalaya and not been found. Some of them were experienced outdoors people. Some of them had GPS. One documented case from 2003 involved a man who entered the basin for a day trip, became disoriented, and was not recovered for 11 days. He was found 5 miles from where he entered. He could not account for where he had been during most of that time. He said the swamp had felt like it was moving around him rather than him moving through it. And then there is what lives in the swamp. Louisiana is home to wildlife that most Americans associate with other continents. The American alligator, which can reach over 14 feet in length and weigh over 1,000 pounds, is so prevalent in Louisiana that the state has over 2 million of them, the largest alligator population in the United States. But the alligator is not the thing that commands the most dread in the oral tradition of the Atchafalaya. That distinction belongs to the creature known as the rougarou. In Louisiana, Cajun and Creole folklore, the rougarou is a werewolf-like entity said to roam the swamps and sugarcane fields at night. It is described as having the body of a man and the head of a dog or wolf, enormous, silent, appearing at the edge of firelight or in the beam of a flashlight at the perimeter of the trees. Unlike most folkloric monsters, the rougarou is not ancient in its origins. It evolved from French werewolf traditions brought by Cajun settlers in the 17th and 18th centuries and merged with indigenous and African spiritual beliefs about shapeshifters, boundary crossers. But what gives the rougarou its particular texture is that it is not presented by the people who grew up with the legend as entertainment. It is presented as warning, as information about what the swamp is at night when the sounds change and the water moves differently. Hunters and trappers who work the Atchafalaya at night speak of the rougarou with a seriousness that is difficult to dismiss. Not as literal belief in a werewolf, but as acknowledgement that the swamp at night is a different place than the swamp in daylight, and that whatever lives in that difference deserves respect. Now we need to talk about voodoo, and we need to talk about it properly, because the word has been so distorted by Hollywood and Halloween costumes that most people have almost no accurate idea of what it actually is. Louisiana voodoo, also called New Orleans voodoo or Louisiana hoodoo, is a genuine and living spiritual practice, a syncretic religion that developed among enslaved African people in Louisiana, combining West African Vodou traditions primarily from the Fon and Yu peoples of what is now Benin, with French Creole Catholicism and indigenous Louisiana spiritual practices. It is not about sticking pins in dolls. It is a highly structured belief system involving a supreme creator god called Bondi, a series of intermediate spirits called Loa who act as intermediaries between the divine and the human, and a sophisticated understanding of the relationship between the living and the dead. In Louisiana voodoo, the dead are not gone. They are present. They are consulted. They have opinions about the affairs of the living, and they make those opinions known through dreams, through coincidence, through the behavior of animals, through the feeling in a room when you walk in and something has changed without any visible cause. The most powerful practitioner in the history of Louisiana voodoo is not a figure from legend, but a historically documented person, Marie Laveau, the voodoo queen of New Orleans, who lived from approximately 1801 to 1881 and wielded influence over the city of New Orleans at every level of society, white and black, rich and poor, Catholic and not, that was extraordinary for any person of her era and almost incomprehensible for a woman of color in the antebellum South. She had informants in every household. She was consulted by judges and politicians. She performed public ceremonies at Congo Square that drew thousands of observers. And she died officially in 1881. But multiple people claimed to see her walking the streets of New Orleans for decades after her death. Not visions, not dreams, people who knew her face, who had spoken to her, who reported seeing her in daylight, in public, conducting herself as if nothing had happened. Her tomb in St. Louis, Cemetery No. 1, is the most visited grave in Louisiana. Visitors still leave offerings, red brick dust, 3 X's scratched into the marble, flowers, rum. The offerings are fresh. They are always fresh. Let us go further back. Before the French arrived in the early 1700s and began building what would become New Orleans, the land at the mouth of the Mississippi was inhabited by several indigenous nations: including the Chitimacha, the Atacapa, and the Natchez. The Natchez people, who lived along the Mississippi River in what is now the Natchez, Mississippi, and northeastern Louisiana area, had a civilization of unusual complexity for the region. They were organized around a strict social hierarchy with a ruler called the Great Sun, a semi-divine king who was carried everywhere on a litter so his feet would not touch the ground, whose dwelling faced east so that he greeted the sunrise each morning, and who was surrounded by a group of women who had vowed to die with him when he died. The Great Sun did not merely represent the sun. He was considered to be the sun's direct descendant, and his body was thought to emit a power that the ground itself could not absorb. When the last great sun died, his retinue died with him not by force, but by choice, according to the accounts of French observers who witnessed it. The Natchez were nearly destroyed in a series of wars with the French in the 1720s and 1730s. The survivors dispersed into other nations, primarily the Chickasaw and the Creek. But the descendants of the Natchez still exist, still carry the name, and still tell the story of the Great Sun, the king whose feet could not touch the earth, whose death was accompanied by willing sacrifice, and whose civilization was erased so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard of it. We need to talk about New Orleans and what it is built on, not metaphorically, literally. The city of New Orleans sits on a floodplain at the mouth of the Mississippi River, a location that every engineer and geographer who assessed it in the early days of French colonization considered unsuitable for permanent settlement. The French governor who ordered the construction of New Orleans in 1718, Jean-Baptiste Le Moyne de Bienville, was explicitly told by his engineers that the land was too wet, too unstable, and too vulnerable to flooding to support a major city. He built it anyway. For strategic reasons, control of the Mississippi meant control of the entire interior of the continent. And from the very beginning, the city flooded. It flooded in 1719, the year after it was founded. It flooded again in 1735 and 1785, and 1,849, and 1,927. And in 2005, when Hurricane Katrina made landfall and the levee system that was supposed to protect the city failed at 53 separate points, flooding 80% of New Orleans and killing over 1,800 people. The storm itself was survivable. What was not survivable was the infrastructure failure. And here's the thing that the engineers who study New Orleans today say quietly to each other in their professional literature. The city cannot be saved permanently. It can be protected temporarily. It can be maintained at enormous expense against the inevitable. But the land is sinking. The sea level is rising, the storms are intensifying, and the Mississippi River, which has been artificially constrained by levees for 100 years, wants to change course. The river has been trying to switch to the Atchafalaya Channel for decades. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers maintains a structure called the Old River Control Structure, specifically to prevent this from happening, because if the Mississippi were allowed to take its natural course, New Orleans would lose its river and its port within years. The city that was built in the wrong place is being held together by a single piece of concrete and steel against the will of the continent's largest river. And yet, through all of it, the city persists. And not merely persists, thrives, creates, produces a culture so distinctive and so powerful that it has shaped American music, American food, American literature, and American spiritual life in ways out of all proportion to its size. New Orleans gave the world jazz, not metaphorically, literally. Jazz was born in New Orleans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in a neighborhood called Storyville, and in the social clubs and funeral parades of the city's Black Creole community. The second line parade in which a jazz band leads a funeral procession through the streets, playing mournful music on the way to the cemetery and joyful, dancing music on the way back, is one of the most distinctly American cultural practices that exists, and it is indigenous to New Orleans. The idea behind it is not complicated, but it is profound. You mourn the dead on the way there, and you celebrate the fact that you are still alive on the way back. Death is not the end of the music. It is the reason for the music. In a city that has spent 300 years being told it should not exist, that is not an accident. Now, let us go into the houses. New Orleans has more documented haunted locations per square mile than almost any other city in the United States. And unlike the manufactured hauntings of theme parks or Halloween attractions, the history behind most of them is real, and it is dark. The LaLaurie Mansion on Royal Street is perhaps the most infamous. Delphine LaLaurie was a socialite and prominent figure in New Orleans society in the 1830s, who was known for her lavish parties and elegant home. In April of 1834, a fire broke out in the kitchen of the mansion, and when firefighters and neighbors rushed in to help, they found something in the attic that the accounts of the time struggled to describe. Enslaved people had been confined there in conditions of extreme brutality. The details of what was found are documented in contemporary newspaper accounts and are too specific to be fabricated. New Orleans, a city that accepted slavery as a legal institution, was so disturbed by what was discovered in that attic that a mob formed and partially destroyed the mansion. Delphine LaLaurie fled to France and was never brought to justice. She died in Paris, probably in 1842. The mansion still stands. It has had dozens of owners over the nearly 2 centuries since. Almost none of them have stayed long. Actor Nicolas Cage bought it in 2007. He defaulted on the mortgage 2 years later. Residents of the surrounding streets say that on certain nights still there are sounds from the upper floors that have no explanation. Not creaking, not settling, something else. Something that sounds, according to those who have heard it, like someone pacing. Let us talk about the bayous at night. The word bayou comes from the Choctaw word bayou, meaning small stream. And Louisiana has thousands of them, slow-moving, brackish channels that wind through the wetlands, connecting lakes and rivers and swamps in a network so complex that even people who have lived among them for generations can become lost. At night, the bayou is a sensory experience unlike almost anything else in North America. The sound alone, the frogs, the insects, the alligators moving in the water, the occasional splash of something large enough to displace a significant amount of water without revealing itself, creates a constant, layered, living wall of sound that disorients and envelops. Fishermen and hunters who have worked the bayous for decades speak of what they call bayou light, small, floating lights seen at a distance over the water or the marsh grass, moving too deliberately to be reflections, too low and too slow to be aircraft. The scientific explanation for bayou light is bioluminescence, or, more likely, marsh gas, methane, and other gases produced by decomposing organic matter in the wetlands, which can in rare conditions ignite spontaneously, producing small, brief flames that hover near the surface. The Cajun name for this phenomenon is feu follet, which translates as foolish fire or will-o'-the-wisp. The old belief, brought from France and modified by Louisiana, is that the feu follet is the soul of an unbaptized child, or sometimes a malevolent spirit, trying to lead travelers off the path and into the deep water. The scientific and the supernatural explanations in this case are not mutually exclusive. The gas is real, the lights are real. Whether what they represent is only chemistry is a question the bayou, as always, declines to answer. Louisiana has a relationship with death that is unlike any other place in the United States. The above-ground cemeteries of New Orleans are the most visible expression of this, and they exist for a practical reason. The water table in New Orleans is so high that traditional in-ground burial was impossible for much of the city's history. Bodies buried in the ground would resurface during floods, so the city built its dead above the earth in ornate stone vaults and mausoleums that became known as cities of the dead. There are 42 of them in New Orleans, and the oldest St. Louis Cemetery No. 1, established in 1789, contains the remains of some of the most significant figures in Louisiana's history, packed into a space barely the size of a city block, but containing over 100,000 burials. Walking through St. Louis Cemetery No. 1 is one of the most concentrated experiences of historical time compression available in the United States. You are walking through 230 years of dead in a space you could cross in 3 minutes. The vaults are stacked. The names on them span generations. And the heat in summer absorbed and held by all that white stone is unlike the heat anywhere else. A radiating, still heat that comes not from above but from all around as if the stone itself is producing it. Guides who lead tours through the cemetery say that first-time visitors sometimes stop in the middle and say they feel watched, not frightened necessarily, just observed, as if the density of what has accumulated in that small space has reached a threshold where it becomes palpable. Let us talk about what is in the water. Louisiana is home to one of the most extraordinary marine and wetland ecosystems in the world, but it is also home to one of the most significant and ongoing environmental disasters in American history. The Deepwater Horizon explosion of April 2010, which killed 11 workers and ruptured a BP oil well on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, resulted in the largest accidental marine oil spill in history. Over the course of 87 days, an estimated 4.9 million barrels of oil were released into the Gulf of Mexico. The oil reached the Louisiana coastline, coating marshes, killing wildlife, and penetrating the food chain in ways that researchers are still documenting 15 years later. Dolphins in the area showed rates of lung disease, reproductive failure, and immune system dysfunction that have not returned to pre-spill levels. The deep sea floor in the affected area, a world that was almost completely unstudied before the spill, showed contamination spreading far beyond what surface models had predicted because the oil did not simply float. It mixed with chemical dispersants applied by BP and formed a substance that sank, coating the seafloor in layers that altered ecosystems that had never been documented in the first place. Scientists who have studied the aftermath say that the full extent of what was lost in the deep Gulf of Mexico in 2010 is unknowable because we did not know what was there before it was damaged. We lost things we had no names for. There's a phenomenon in Louisiana that scientists call land memory, and it refers to something that has no precise parallel anywhere else in the United States. When the Mississippi River flooded before it was leveed, it deposited sediment across the surrounding floodplain in broad sheets. This sediment compacted over centuries into the slightly elevated ridges that are the highest and most stable ground in southern Louisiana, a few feet above sea level, running along the natural paths of old river channels. These ridges, called chenures in coastal Louisiana and natural levees inland, are where every indigenous settlement, every colonial village, every Cajun community chose to build because they were the only solid ground. And they can still be seen today, not as elevated land, but as lines of old oak trees running through the marshes, trees that mark the paths of rivers that no longer exist, following the contours of a landscape that has been underwater for 100 years or more. You can drive through coastal Louisiana and read the ghost geography of the old land in the tree lines. The land remembers where the ground was even after the ground is gone. And those tree lines are retreating. Every decade, a few more of them disappear beneath the water. The memory is eroding along with everything else. Louisiana, then, is not a place that yields itself easily to description or to understanding or to any category that the rest of the country uses to organize itself. It is too wet to be fully land and too inhabited to be fully water. It is too Catholic to be Protestant and too voodoo to be entirely Catholic. It is too old to be American in the way the rest of America is American, and too alive musically, culinarily, spiritually, to be simply historical. It is a place that has been told it should not exist and has responded by producing some of the most extraordinary human culture on the continent. It is a place where the dead are buried above the ground because the ground will not hold them, where the river is held in place by an act of ongoing human will against its natural instinct, where the lights over the marsh at night may be chemistry or maybe something older than chemistry, and where a woman who died in 1881 is still receiving offerings at her tomb from people who leave them fresh every morning. The swamp is not a backdrop, it is a participant. And Louisiana, more than almost anywhere else in the United States, knows the difference.